Dr. Joshua Landis, it's a pleasure for me to host you on Syriana Analysis. This is your first appearance, and hopefully, I will be able to host you more. I believe your insight is very important for the followers and the fans of Syriana Analysis, and they are looking forward for an academic and objective opinions regarding the U.S. foreign policy shift towards Syria. As we can see that in the past few months. The policies of the United States towards Syria has been a little bit relaxed, and especially when it comes to the regional countries opening up to Syria. And therefore, I want to focus on the United States and also the Arab nations trying to normalize their relations again with Syria, and especially with President Assad. Now, the first question is now, despite this, the Biden administration says that it will not normalize relations with Assad, okay? But it doesn't seem to be objecting any longer Washington's Arab partners from doing so. How this change of policy happened when we were expecting, actually, I was also expecting Biden to escalate the military conflict in Syria.
Well, first of all, let me just say it's a pleasure being on your show, Kevork, and and secondly, I think America is caught in a dilemma today because, as you know, the U.S. regime, the U.S. government is very inimical to Syria. It does not like Syria. It wants Assad still to come to some political solution, which means that, according to 2254, the UN resolution, that there has to be UN oversight and elections, and theoretically, Assad has to step aside. This is really a euphemism for political solution, is a euphemism for Assad stepping aside and the opposition somehow taking a role in Damascus. It's very vague exactly how this is going to take place, but it is the major demand of the Syrian opposition that this formula continue to be repeated by the United States because the opposition doesn't want to see the United States, slowly go back to normal with Syria. At the same time, the United States is under intense pressure from its Arab allies to allow them to normalize relations and to get trade because all of them are collapsing economically and under intense pressure. So as long as Syria is off limits to the Arab world, and that's, it isn't, when America says we're not going to normalize, that's also code for, because it's not just about normalization, of course. It's not whether America sends an ambassador to Damascus. That's really of little consequence to the Assad government. What's really important are sanctions, and in that, secondary sanctions, meaning can the United States, or will the United States, impose sanctions on any businessman, Lebanese, Jordanian, Turk, who goes into Syria and signs a contract to help rebuild electricity generation or whatever it's going to be, rebuild a school. And the United States will do that and has preserved those secondary sanctions. So that doesn't allow anybody else to normalize relations. They can send an ambassador, but they cannot send businessmen. They cannot engage in trade, and that's what they really want. So when the United States says we're not going to normalize, and in these three no's of Blinken, which is no normalization, no lifting sanctions, and no reconstruction, it's telling the Arab governments, your businessmen are not welcome in Damascus. And that's the real problem. It's not about American normalization. It's about the normalization of the rest of the Arab world. At the same time, the United States doesn't want to just say no to the Arab governments because, first of all, it doesn't really have the ability to do so. And secondly, it's worried. It's worried that Jordan will go the way of Lebanon, that other governments will slowly crumble
Seriously,
because of the economic
I
pressure.
had the impression that it's the United States who changed its tone towards Syria, and then the Arab countries followed suit. But what you're saying is that countries such as, for example, Jordan and the UAE, they're the ones who practice pressure on Washington. They have the
Yes,
means of pressure.
yes. We look at when Jordan went to Washington. Top of his list was we want to open the border all the way with Syria. We need to get our refugees to send them home. There's pressure on us, and the king has been complaining about that. Abdullah Thani has been complaining about that right along, which is we have too many refugees. We can't pay for them. Nobody else is going to really pay for them. Our schooling system is under intense pressure, and nobody's got a job. And Jordan's been growing at a very slow pace because the Iraqi economy is in the dumps. The Syrian economy, they can't trade with Syria through Syria to Lebanon. And there used to be $2 billion worth of trade coming, transit trade from Lebanon through Jordan, much of it to the Gulf. All of that's come to a screeching halt. And of course, Egypt, tourism is way down, and tourism between Egypt and Jordan used to be the big thing. So Jordan became isolated in a world where it's getting some tourists that come from Israel and go to Jordan, but really tourism which was a big part of the economy, has really come to a screeching halt.
But wasn't this
and that's the problem.
But wasn't this consequence was expected from the Jordanian side? I mean, in the past, at least between 2012 and 2018.
But the collapse of Lebanon, Kevork, the collapse of Lebanon, it really put America, I think, in a bind, because who's going to benefit from the collapse of Lebanon? Well, nobody benefits, but Hezbollah is in a position to become stronger and stronger, because as the Lebanese army crumbles and as other communities, particularly Christians and Sunni Muslims, are under intense pressure, their elites are going to leave Lebanon because they have the capacity, they've got the money, they've got the relatives abroad. The Shiites do not. As the poorest, who have less relations with the West, they're the ones who are going to stay. And Hezbollah has been under lock and key. It's a tough organization. It's the one that's going to survive in this dog-eat-dog world that is now Lebanon. And the United States recognizes that. So it's contemplated putting sanctions on Lebanon and putting Lebanon in the same kind of regime and treating it like it's just a lackey of Iran and intense pressure. But that's really not a solution. And the Lebanese are lobbying like mad in Washington. You can't put sanctions on, which means you have to help the Lebanese army. You have to counter Hezbollah by allowing trade. And then we had that gas shortage and the cutoff of electricity. And Hezbollah was saying, the Iranians will give us very inexpensive oil. And all of Lebanon's looking at this and thinking, do we have to go this way? And so America came up with the, reopening the Arab gas pipeline through Jordan. And that was another leverage for the king and on America saying, we can't maintain this sanction regime on Syria in the same way because it's going to blow up in our own face. It's bad for everybody. And the Europeans are worried about more refugees, especially with Afghanistan collapsing now. But the whole Syrian situation is bad. And they don't want more refugees. They want refugees to go home to Syria. And as long as the United States is strangling Syria economically, there's going to be more and more refugees.
I'm gonna ask you two questions here because taking from what you said, for example, in Lebanon, this is very important because the past few weeks there were escalation there. I'm not gonna just blame one side, but at least one of the sides, which is the Lebanese Forces Party headed by Samir Jaja, they were one of the main players who escalated the situation there. And the Jaja party, they are pro let's say, Saudi Arabia and pro the United States. So this escalation by the Jaja party, as you mentioned, it's not serving the American interests in Lebanon because it plays in the hands of Hezbollah, right?
Yes, they were unruly. The Christian right shot, we presume it was a Christian right, shot 6 Shiites who were demonstrating. Now, this was an orchestrated demonstration by Hezbollah, but Hezbollah's people are fairly disciplined. And so the shooting began with the Christians, a very provocative defense of this judge who is being pushed out for the obvious reasons by Hezbollah, because Hezbollah sees this as a threatening situation to it. But it only underlines the way things can escalate in Lebanon very quickly. And everybody understands that if they escalate and it goes towards shooting situation, Hezbollah is going to come out on top. And the United States doesn't want that. It doesn't need more deterioration. Iraq is in a very precarious situation. But so far, America needs to baby it along. But Iraq needs more trade with Syria. The whole region needs trade. And I think even as we've seen, the smaller Gulf countries have been opening up relations with Syria. They want to bring Syria back in, as they say, to its normal place in the Middle East and bring it back into the Arab League. Saudi Arabia is still sitting on the sidelines. Saudi Arabia's relationship with Washington, of course, is a delicate one, but it doesn't want to get out ahead. It doesn't want to annoy Washington on the Syria file. But Saudi Arabia, I think, is ready to open relations with Syria. It's worried about Turkey in particular. And if you listen to Saudis, they're beginning to see Turkey on a scale with Iran, not quite as much of a challenge as Iran,
Yes.
but still, they don't want to see Turkey take big hunks of Syria and keep it. They don't. Turkey has been challenging Saudi Arabia for leadership of the Sunni world, and that's something that they resent a great deal.
Do you think the Saudis and the Emiratis, or like a smaller countries such as Kuwait and Bahrain, who are all sending some positive signals now to Syria, would help Syria against the Turkish expansion in the north, like financially at least?
You know, I think that it's really it's going to be on the private level more. It's that Saudi companies and Gulf companies in general want to get in, particularly on the real estate, and that's where they can help the most because land properties are dirt cheap in Syria. People are
Yes,
under intense pressure and they're selling their land for nothing.
that's true.
And you can't find land like that anywhere else in the Middle East for such a little price, especially land that's near the coast. And this is the time, if you're a deal hunter, this is a time to be making deals in Syria, purchasing land, talking about rebuilding. But it's not from the goodness of your heart. It's because you want to make a profit. And
Yes.
there's a lot of money to be made in Syria over the long run if you're willing to take risks. Because of course we know it's a monstrous risk in the Syrian environment, which has very little law and order where you have to pay bribes. But if you have that kind of muscle, you could do it. And so that's the situation. I think Saudi Arabia is eager, and I think the Arab world is beginning to realize that so long as they're at daggers drawn with each other, that there's a state of sort of unspoken civil war between the Arab countries, and that they're in total chaos. Iran and Turkey both are going to prey on the Arab world, and they're going to take more and more, and they're going to become stronger in the Arab world. The only way to begin to push out Iranian influence, or at least balance Turkish and Iranian influence, is by a strong Arab world and some form of unity and some kind of economic well-being. Otherwise, people are totally dependent on Iran. Today, Syria is completely dependent on Iran because nobody else will do business. So the Gulf has to step up and begin to put this war situation behind it. And I think that's what they're saying. It's not because they like Assad or they think everything is hunky-dory. It's because they're worried about Iran first and Turkey second.
And I think Syria is interested in balancing its relations also between the Arab nations and Iran as well. It's a role that Syria likes to play as a not a mediator, but a balancing force in the region.
Absolutely.
But in
Hafez al-Assad was a master at this. I mean, he never got too close to either Hezbollah or Iran, and he was the one who rekindled relations with Turkey. And Bashar did that after him. It was Bashar al-Assad who was the first Syrian leader since independence to go to Turkey, to sit with Erdogan, and to follow Turkey's lead. His 4Cs, 5Cs plan, economic plan was modeled after Erdogan's no enemies with neighbors and so forth plan. It really was a copy, and he came up with that plan after he came back from Ankara. So yes, this is the normal situation for Syria, which is a fairly weak country, to try to balance the larger countries off and to use its geographical position, which is very important in the center of the entire Mashriq, as to its greatest advantage. And that's what it has, and that's what it's trying to use again today, because the oil pipelines, because of trade, transit trade, everybody needs to go through Syria. They need Syria to be stable.
Dr. Landis, the former U.S. ambassador to Syria, Robert Ford, told the Newsweek this week that, I quote, Assad will stay in power. I think no one argues nowadays about the fate of Assad. But Robert Ford made statements in the past about the Kurds and that the US will not protect them. Given the current situation in Afghanistan, do you think the US will withdraw from Syria soon? And if it happened, what would be the destiny of the US backed Kurdish militias in the East?
I don't think it's going to be soon. I think that Biden administration is really pretty wedded to the Kurds, and having pulled out of Afghanistan was a Biden administration has taken a big beating for losing the Middle East, withdrawing from the Middle East, of caving in to our competitors, Russia and China, and so forth. So I think that he's not going to want to do that in Syria, where he'll get a lot of criticism. And after all, we're spending very little money. The United States is spending very little money in Syria, very few troops. It's easy to maintain the situation. He will maintain it. Whether the next administration does, that's the big question. Because keeping our, when you look at it objectively, once the situation of ISIS is really resolved, and it's not quite resolved today, but it's mostly resolved, and the natural, it's quite clear that the best way to police this region is for the state governments to police it, for Assad to police it. And that's what was the situation previously, and that's going to be the situation in the future. The question is, when can it withdraw? And I think that's going to happen fairly quickly after the Biden administration, because the logical alternative is for the United States to really help an independent Kurdish state emerge in the Northeast. And that's what, although the Kurds say we just want autonomy and so forth, and we'll be happy to go back to Syria as soon as there's a different kind of government and a political solution, that's all, that would require regime change in Damascus, and it's not going to happen. And even the Syrian opposition, the Arab opposition, don't like the Kurds and don't want to give the Kurds autonomy either. So the Kurds face a rather hopeless situation if they're ever going to return, under the control of Damascus. And we have to remember that the Kurdish region has traditionally been the poorest region of Syria. It doesn't have universities. It doesn't have, they're trying to build them now, but it doesn't have the infrastructure for a nation state. And we've seen that most clearly with oil refinery. They don't have refineries. They have to send their oil to Syria in order to be refined, and it sends it back. And that's increasingly the Kurds have been pressuring the United States once again to send their oil to Damascus. And America, the Biden administration, has closed its eyes to this trade increasingly and has allowed it where Trump tried to stop it. And that's that underlines how weak the Kurdish position is. And secondly, and most importantly for the United States, it is the major bone of contention between Turkey and the United States.
Yes.
It is Turkey's support for Syria's Kurds that has driven a giant wedge between Erdogan and the United States and continues to impede any kind of improvement in relations. And that's costing the United States a great deal. The U.S. keeps on thinking, we can have both good relations with Ankara and good relations with the Kurds. But that's not true. And Erdogan's made it very clear that that's not true. So that price is going to go up and up over time. And I think the United States, what can it really get out of the region? A few airports, a little leverage with Assad against Iran. But it's really hurting its position in the long run in the Middle East. And it's destabilizing the region. It's going to allow for ISIS to continue in the region. Because as long as you've got bad relations between the Northeast and Damascus and Ankara and Iraq, you're going to have a sort of no man's land where ISIS can run between these different armies and exploit the instability in the region.
Not only the United States is harming its own interests, but also, in my opinion, the Kurdish separatists, being just specific about them, are also harming their own interests. Let's suppose, for an argument's sake, that there would be a Kurdish state in Syria. Just for an argument's sake, what kind of a state it's going to be? It's an ethnic state, and it's going to be surrounded, it will be like an island. It will be surrounded by hostile environment, hostile neighbors. Syria is not going to accept, Turkey is not going to accept. So how can they survive in such a very hostile environment? For them, in my opinion, the best solution, of course, I'm speaking as a Syrian who wants to restore every inch of the country back to the central government, is to allow the Kurds to have their cultural rights, fully cultural rights, just like the Armenians used to have before the war. And for them, the non-administrative, non-political and administrative autonomy, or further autonomy in their region. That's all acceptable, I think, from the Damascus government. But the political autonomy is going to be a matter of a war. This war is not only coming from Syria, but also from Turkey. So they will be squeezed between two sides. And it's happening in the north now. Erdogan is threatening now to advance further in this northern belt, and he's saying that he's going to conduct a military offensive again in Syria. But taking from the experience of the past years, Kurds cannot resist the Turkish army, and they're going to lose and lose and lose more lands. And until when? Until when the Kurdish separatists are going to come to the consensus that they have to talk directly to Damascus and come to an agreement with it? Because not only the regional countries are opening now, but also secretly, also some European countries are opening with Damascus, and it's not going to be in favor of the Kurdish interests if this policy continues, because they will find themselves losing lands in the next years in favor of Turkey.
Right. Well, I think that the Kurds see it a little bit differently. Of course, they feel that they have been denied a nation state for a very large number of people and their cultural autonomy, and they feel that Arab nationalism has been very prejudiced against them, and that you know, whether it's the opposition or the Ba'ath Party, this defining Syria as an Arab nation without not a Syrian nation where Kurds have equal rights with other people, has been very damaging, I think, in the long run. Now, so the Kurds, from their point of view, I think they're thinking the longer we can hold out with U.S. help, the higher our chances of getting a better deal with Damascus. If you look at Iraq, for example, no Iraqi Arab would have thought that the Kurds could have the level of autonomy that they have today in Iraq. When the U.S. first marched in to Iraq and overturned Saddam, the Iraqis were horrified. And I remember Syrians were horrified that Kurdish could be made an equal language with Arabic. It would just seem very unnatural because of Aruba and the Arab nationalism. And today, though, more and more Iraqis have gotten used to the idea that the Kurds are going to have a great deal of autonomy, even if they're still having fights over whether they could separate. And the Kurds clearly would have liked to have that referendum and separate. And the Iraqi army marched into Kirkuk and stopped it. So it isn't about agreement. It's still about a balance of power. But the Iraqi Kurds have benefited from America's presence in the country, long presence. And I think the Syrians are thinking, look at what we've gotten so far. If we just can draw this out for another 4, 8, 10 years, the Syrians will adjust to the fact that we're going to have our own language and a degree of autonomy. That's the way I think. Of course, realpolitik, the Kurds have very little possibility of really achieving the kind of independence or autonomy that they want in the north, and that they're going to have to come to grips with Damascus, because Turkey is infinitely worse for them than making a deal with with Damascus.
I agree. Now, coming back to the Arabic countries, the UAE and Syria agreed this week to boost the economic relations, and Abu Dhabi is now investing in the energy sector in Syria. Are the Emiratis approaching the Syrians from purely an economic perspective, or they have a tacit agenda? Why I'm asking you this, because some Syrians say that the UAE is infiltrating the Syrian economy and the Syrian society. How? For example, they're granting visas, they're granting golden residencies to the elites, let's say, of Syria, from the intellectuals, from the art scene, actors, singers, scientists, engineers, doctors, name it. Like thousands of Syrians are moving now to the UAE, and because the UAE has normalized the relations with Israel, and now the Syrians are getting used also to be in contact maybe with Israelis in the same company or in the same office that they're working. So do you think the UAE is playing a role here in order to change, as a soft power, to change the mindset of the Syrians in for them to accept the normalization of relations with Israel in the future between Syria and Israel?
I don't think that's uppermost on their mind. I think it's a part of their general policy of being against the Muslim Brotherhood and trying to exploit Israel's clear advantages in the Middle East. And that's going to be something that Saudi Arabia does as well. And we've, this new city that Nome that MBS is building only 40 miles from the Israeli border in Eilat. I think everybody is thinking we want to copy the Israeli model and have a high-tech society and be part of the modern world and grow at big economic leaps and bounds. And increasingly, I think the Arab elites realize that all this fighting over identity, who's going to rule, has been extremely damaging, and this backwards looking really obsession with religious identity has left the Middle East in a terrible position without an economic plan. And most of the opposition parties don't have an economic plan. That's not what they're putting forward. Their plans are about identity. We're going to be Islamic country, Sharia law, and that has been very detrimental to the entire region and has left it in economic, backwater. And so the smart elites, I think, are thinking, how do we get out of that? Now, is the UAE got a big plan for Syria? I don't think so. I think they're wisely exploiting the very talented Syrian elite and allowing them to come to the country because they've got money, they've got intelligence, and a great advantages. And everybody who's smart should be taking them in because they're an extraordinarily accomplished elite. And as I think that in a sense they're thinking long term, this is going to help us to reestablish good relations with Syria. But I don't think that I don't think that this is about Israel.
But speaking of Israel, how is Israel perceiving this development, especially that the regional countries are opening up with Syria?
Well, I think it's important. It is important. The Arab gas pipeline, reopening that. I think a lot of Israelis were thinking, Israeli gas, Egyptian gas, it's all one pipeline. This is a way to increasingly build some kind of economic relations, not only with Jordan and Egypt, but also with Syria and Lebanon in the future. And that we're normalizing the Abraham Accords, of course. Any Israeli thinks, look, we've normalized relations with lots of Arab countries. Of course, they're not the Arab countries that have been most affected by the conflict, the Arab-Israeli conflict. But increasingly, the Arab world is recognizing that the Palestinian search for a state is not going to happen, right? The Palestinian putting everything on hold with Israel for the Palestinian problem to be resolved is not working. And so all these countries that have signed the Abraham Accords have basically said to themselves, the Palestinians aren't getting a state, and we cannot stop our relations with Israel and with the United States, in a sense, as a secondary relationship. We've got to move ahead with this. And with the UAE getting sophisticated armaments and airplanes from America for signing this accord, that's what it's about. They want to move ahead. They want the best military equipment, and if signing peace with Israel is going to get them that stuff, they're going to do it. And that's very bad for the Palestinians. But increasingly, I think it's going to be the way people think. Already, many Syrians think, what can we do for Palestine? We're never going to get, we're too weak to really change the balance of power. And I know many Palestinians still cling to the hope that somehow Syria will be an important leverage in their favor. But that's what's happening in the world. And I think Israel thinks that opening up more relations will eventually be good for them.
Dr. Landis, this is my last question to you, and I received a lot of hate for for saying this. I think Turkey is a bigger threat to Syria than Israel, and I tried to explain this. Some people made some emotional reactions, but in my opinion, Turkey is able to occupy territories in Syria, is able to Turkify and keep that territories in the region due to cultural reason, due to religion, due to language, and a lot of we don't know the percentage, but a lot of Syrians really, especially those in the north now in Idlib, they are seeing themselves like they're becoming Turks, right? And historically, Turkey has a track record, especially during the Ottoman Empire, the Turkification policy that happened in the region. So my opinion is Turkey is a bigger threat to Syria right now than Israel, because Israel is only able to occupy territories through military means. They have a hard power. Turkey has hard power and also soft power. This was my explanation. So the big elephant in the room here is, in my opinion, Erdogan's Turkey, which is not sparing any chance to occupy more Syrian lands in the north and even Turkify the areas under its control, name it in Jarablus, in Afrin, in Idlib, and now they're building schools and teaching Turkish and the Turkish lira, etc. Now, with the Idlib offensive is on the side, Erdogan is threatening to attack Kurdish-controlled areas in the north. How is Erdogan managing its military occupation of Syria with the crumbling Turkish economy? And do you believe a rapprochement is possible between Syria and Turkey, or the Syrians should wait maybe in elections in Turkey and the new government without Erdogan, for example?
I agree with you that Turkey is a much more immediate and bigger danger today than Israel. Israel has largely absorbed the Golan Heights. We've just heard from the new Israeli prime minister that he intends to increase from about 25,000 to 100,000 as settlers in Golan. And this process is underway. And anybody who's visited the Golan will see that it's being Israelified. Now, Israel had held back from allowing more and more settlers into the region for a long time, keeping the Golan on the table for some kind of negotiation. And as we saw with the last round of negotiations, possibly some kind of a park up there where neither the Syrians nor the Israelis would really have control over it. But it would be a no man's land. And that was, I think, what was on the table for Syria. And today that's really slipping off the table because Syria is so weak and in such chaos. But Idlib is newly occupied. North Aleppo, newly occupied. That's a very fluid situation. But I agree with you that very rapidly, the citizens of those regions will want to be Turks. We saw that already, of course, with Skanderun in the 1930s, where many of the Sunni Arabs preferred to be Turks than to be part of Syria for obvious reasons. Turkey had a lot to offer. And today, it's the same way. If I were a kid, if I were a family living in those regions with children, where would I want them to go to school? I would want them to be Turks and go to school in Turkey because the country is so much more developed. The chances of them having a happy life are greater. Now, that's, I know that's very controversial to say, but I fear that that's the way many people are thinking in northern Syria. So if Damascus wants to get this region back, it needs to move quickly, and it needs to make some compromises to do so. And I think Russia is playing a very positive role for Damascus in this sense by keeping the military pressure, keeping economic pressure, all kinds of pressure on Ankara to increasingly move back from this territory. That means that Syria needs to get its own military house in order and its economic house in order, because it's got to be able to offer these people up there an alternative. And today, it doesn't have a good alternative to offer them economically, in terms of jobs, in terms of a future. So Syria needs to regularize its own house, and it has to prioritize. And clearly, decreasing its battle with Israel would help it in every single way, because as we know, Syria has largely not been of great interest to the United States and Washington. It's of interest because of Israel.
Israel.
And the United States sees Syria as a subset of its relationship with Israel. So the more that Syria antagonizes Israel, the more America is going to sit on Israel, continue sanctions, and hurting the economy. And that will jeopardize chances of Assad retrieving the north of Syria.
Maybe this is a controversial thing to say, but it is realistic. Unfortunately, Syria has to prioritize its also objectives in Syria and how to restore the territories, to grab them slowly. And unfortunately, it's squeezed between different regional countries from the north, from the south, and also the international sanctions. But hopefully, these sanctions would be relieved in the near future, because, in my opinion, Syrians deserve at least to have a better life. And what's happening in Syria nowadays is truly sickening me, and it's really sad to see Syrians when let's say, during the past 10 years, there were really harsh battles and wars, but the living standards were better. In the past 3 years, the people are really fed up nowadays, and they're speaking very loud, and they want to leave the country, and it's emptying the country also from the hand power, and also the intellectuals are leaving to the Gulf. So it's really devastating to see from a Syrian point of view. This devastation in Syria has to come to an end. The Syrian government has to make compromises, but also the regional and international countries should also extend their hand and try to help the Syrians instead of imposing further sanctions, because all this talk about targeted sanctions, we know it's not true. Especially when you sanction the central bank and you sanction transactions, and Syrians cannot make business with the outside world, and the outside world cannot make business with Syria. Dr. Landis, it was a really pleasure talking to you. You made a really brilliant points. I'm sure that the audience of Syriana Analysis appreciate your insight, and hopefully I can also invite you soon in the near future.
It'd be my pleasure. And thank you, Kevork, for very challenging questions and for all of your work on Syria.
Thank you very much. And my friends, if you are new, please consider subscribing. And if you want to support Syriana Analysis, you can become a patron. It really helps me to create a content like this. I will keep hosting experts in the next episodes in order for us to discuss the topics related to Syria, but also related to Far East Asia regarding Taiwan. And see you next time.